So we're here tonight to talk about documentary film, activism, and community. And activism and community are terms we've heard a lot, right? So we probably have specific ideas in our mind about what those terms mean. Activism sort of being a little more sexy of the two terms, and we probably have maybe specific ideas about who an activist is or what might constitute activism. But what I want to talk about tonight is the relationship between activism and community, and how we might reimagine that relationship, and specifically in the context of kind of our present society, where we're seeing like increasing wealth disparities, we're seeing kind of a lack of access to quality education, we're seeing increased surveillance and sort of kind of military, environmental, economic crises that we're in right now. So how can we really think about this relationship between activism and community in this sort of current context? So as the sort of first speaker, I've been asked to provide some definitions and guidelines that we can kind of work from tonight. And I'm not so interested in exact definitions, but I think it would be sort of a good starting point so we can all kind of be like at the same, sort of at a base level together. And then from there we can kind of expand on, my hope is that we can sort of expand on, critique, and sort of build from there. So let's start with advocacy then, advocacy media. Advocacy media, I think, specifically often includes a request for action. So there's maybe a specific objective in mind if we're thinking about advocacy media. And it often works within the existing system. So maybe calling for policy change or specific changes in law. And examples could include maybe online petitions, could include marches or organizing people to show up at a specific event, or even what we've seen a lot recently with social media, sort of like Instagram solidarity. There's post a picture of yourself holding a sign or wearing something as sort of this social media solidarity. And then moving on to activist media, it often works outside of the system. So it's calling attention to the system, maybe larger societal or political change. And examples might include public protests, sort of public actions, maybe civil disobedience. And I think the main difference for us to sort of keep in mind is advocacy works within the system and activists is working outside of the system. So documentary film can be seen as activist or advocacy, and I think ideally the two approaches can work together a little bit. So activists might be used as a first line of action to initiate discussion, direct attention, and sort of make space for maybe an advocacy campaign to come in and secure policy changes, while this sort of long-term, sort of a larger systemic change is taking place. So that's sort of our rough definitions, but I think tonight we want to expand on those and stretch those a little bit. And so in activist media, we talk a lot about content. So what's the issue being addressed? What's the specific change being called for? And a lot of times the form of activist media, we don't really talk about that as much. And I think the form is actually an area that sort of holds a lot of potential for reimagining what activism media can be. And in order to kind of understand how the form might affect our media making, I want to kind of give like a brief overview of the media landscape. So in the US, 90% of the media produced and available is controlled by only 6 corporations. And that's actually kind of a similar trend that's happening all over the world. And that trend is sort of the concentration and ownership of media in the hands of a very small group. And that raises, it's kind of, it's alarming for a number of reasons, but specifically because of the ownership in the hands of kind of a chosen corporate view or state view. We're seeing a decrease in the diversity of images, stories, and perspective. We're seeing decrease in funding to independently created media, and then also a decrease in access to independently produced media, and then increased privatization of public media. And so even though we're seeing a decrease in the variety of images, we're seeing an increase in the amount of images, right? We're surrounded by more images today than at any other time in history. So our TVs, our cell phones, on the sides of buses, kind of everywhere we turn, we're seeing images. And the majority of these images are upholding a certain kind of relationship, or they're kind of establishing a certain kind of form between the creator and the viewer. And this is sort of, we can kind of think of it as it's sort of just a kind of a one-way flow chart, which is the creator as sort of the expert. And so creator could be artist, the creator could be corporation, creator could be state, and then the spectator is the consumer, sort of a passive consumer. So you have one role that's active and then one that's just sort of passive consumption. And that's problematic for a lot of reasons. And one of those being that because we're surrounded by so many images, if you're not considered a media creator, or if you don't have the skills or the resources to create media, then you're just relegated to sort of this role of consumption. So in creating my own work, and you all saw an example of one of our interviews from the documentary series Signified, a good friend of mine and I created Signified together. And so when we were originally creating it, it just started out as a documentary series, because we're sort of surrounded by all these kind of amazing folks in our community that were doing wonderful work, and we were wondering why no one knew kind of more about the work that they were doing. And so we started out with a documentary series, which went well, we loved it, but then it didn't seem like enough. And so after doing the documentary series, we started doing a lot of media literacy training, resource sharings, and creating free public spaces for people to kind of get together and talk about the issues that were being discussed in the documentary series. And let's see, I'm trying not to run over on time. That's what I'm checking right now. So I guess I'll try to wrap this up a little bit. But to kind of return to the activism and community and sort of these new relationships that we might create between the two, I wanted to kind of share some words and advice from an activist and organizer that's from my home state in Michigan. She's actually based in Detroit, Michigan, and her name is Grace Lee Boggs, and she's a 99-year-old activist. So she actually, for the last 70 years, she's been involved in everything from, movements from the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the women's movement, the Asian American movement, and more recently the environmental justice movement. So she has quite a bit of experience. And she, in one of her recent books, which is called Revolution and Evolution in the 21st Century, she talks about the strategies of activism that worked in the past are not, even though they were successful in the past, they're not kind of relevant to where we are today. And particularly those strategies are having kind of one leader, or maybe kind of like a messiah type figure that communities look to, and then we sort of follow that leader, and then the changes are made. But her kind of observations is that that's actually not going to work for where we are now. And with a lot of the activism that's taking place, we're already sort of reforming. We've already kind of moved away from that. And so she says that social change will not be brought about by a leader, but by a networked organism. And this idea of the networked organism is actually also discussed by author Paul Hawkins, who wrote Blessed Unrest, which is about it's Blessed Unrest, the movement that changed the world and why no one saw it coming. So he references this idea of the organism and the decentering of our activist movements. And this is a quote from Paul Hawkins. He says, "The movement can't be divided because it is so atomized, a collection of small pieces loosely joined. It forms, dissipates, and then regathers quickly without central leadership, command, or control. Rather than seeking dominance, this unnamed movement strives to disperse concentrations of power. It has been capable of bringing down governments, companies, and leaders through witnessing, informing, and massing. Its clout resides in ideas, not in force." So as media makers, our call to action is not only to produce new images, but to create new forms and relationships. Relationships that facilitate spaces for dialogue, questioning, sharing of resources, and collective imagination. What I actually want to end with is it's a shorter episode from Signified. It's about 5 minutes long. And it's an interview with Alexis Pauline Youngs. And I think she does a nice kind of summary of what's kind of required for activism and community building in the present day. So I'm going to end with that, and then...
Could we shorten it?
Yeah.
Elizabeth?
Sure. Maybe I'll play it.